You're about to hear from Jeff Sugar of iTech Entertainment Corporation. Jeff's a landscape architect. Buildings reside in places, urban, suburban, rural, but they all reside somewhere. And we architects like to think that we are capable of responding to the innate characteristics of a site when we get there and doing something with it. And Jeff is going to show in a moment or two that we're probably at our best when we allow the landscape to be the setting of the story we're trying to tell. And when we're willing to preserve what's best about a place, but maybe also be willing to change things and to reinforce that story. And so we've talked about Shakira, and we've talked about Steve Martin. And as far as I know, Jeff knows no one who is famous. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Sugar.
Thank you, sir. 100% correct. I know nobody. Nobody famous except nobody. So, as Al was saying, I'm a landscape architect by trade. So, with that nomenclature comes no respect whatsoever. If you tell someone you're a landscape architect, they're like, oh, my nephew cuts grass as well. It took me almost 4 years to explain to my grandmother why I'm going to college to plant trees. So, she still never believed it to the day she died. So, landscape. So today we're going to take a little trip. Why landscape? Where it all started. And then we'll go ahead and take a look at how landscape works in a themed environment. So, the very unique thing about landscape is it's constantly changing. And everybody has a connection to that change. So much that it changes not only every 4 months through the growing season, but it also goes from a sapling all the way to a tree that's anywhere from up to 200 to 300 years old. And then what landscape does for us is it kind of creates this emotional response as we grow throughout our life. So when we see a tree with a swing on it, we go back to our childhood. When we see a grand majestic oak, we look at it as almost as our grandfather that's dropped all its acorns everywhere and sprouted families. So if we take this emotional trip, and look at how landscape drives our emotions. You know, under this big majestic tree, we feel very, very protected. If we go through a bamboo, or I'm sorry, landscape can be very whimsical as well. This is a topiary in the Atlantic Botanic Gardens, a whole series of sculptures built throughout the Botanic Gardens to showcase the whimsical nature of landscape. Or we can feel in awe in a bamboo forest somewhere in Japan, or very relaxed. Landscape is so powerful that this image right here, the first thing you should think of is Corona beer. Corona, probably one of the worst beers you could ever drink, is sold solely on the experience of being on a beach under palm trees. That's how powerful landscape is. It can also make you feel very tranquil. Reflect on your life, reflect on everything, while you're drinking a better beer from the Northeast. Make you feel scared. We're coming up on Halloween. Nothing spookier than a tree with no leaves, because it's dead. So you mix into that, you can feel very, very hot, but at the same time you can also feel very, very cold. Now not just landscape provides an emotional state, but it also can invoke senses. Sense. So there's no greater time in Florida except for those first 2 or 3 weeks of March when all the orange blossoms are in bloom. It's the best smell you'll ever smell. Unfortunately, there's not many orange groves, but whenever I smell that, all I can think of is being in 3rd grade running through orange groves. Lavender fields in France is amazing. Not just scents, though. Also sounds. If you go back to that first picture that I showed, where we're walking through that bamboo forest, mix into that the sounds of the creaking bamboo up above through the winds, or the winds through the palm fronds on the beach, drinking that Corona again. Or fall leaves falling to the ground. Again, the emotional response of the landscape mixed with your senses creates this connection that everybody has with landscape. So we have all these emotions that we're working with, and then we're going to tell a story with it. So before we get to tell the story, let's go ahead and take a very, very quick look back of where everything from a themed entertainment standpoint with regards to landscape started from. So I'm going to go ahead and go from year 000 to the medieval times, or to medieval times, 1700s in Europe. These things started growing called palace gardens. So the palace gardens were these plots of lands that were either owned by the state, by the church, or by very, very rich people. And what they wanted is they wanted to have a place where they could escape and use the landscape to kind of tell this story. So if we look in the top right, yeah, that's top right, Villa d'Este, built into a cliff. And the way it was designed is it took into account that topography and played with the water from the very bottom all the way to the top to tell this story and the journey of the water through a landscape. And then the counterpart to that would be Villa d'Este, or Villa Atlante, on the left side. Flat terrain, still a very formal garden, and it uses landscape to tell the story. And then if we go down to the bottom right, we have Stourhead in England, which is the very, very, very first precursor to, I guess, a theme park or a themed environment. The lakes were man-made, the architectural follies in the distance were land-made, and there were actually transportation devices to get you here and back because it was so far to walk. They were called horses. The granddaddy of all palace gardens, Versailles. Louis XIV said, you know, I'm really sick of Paris. Let's go outside of Paris and let's build the biggest and baddest palace garden of all. And Versailles is exactly that. Walking through Versailles in the middle of July when it's about 100 degrees, you will curse Louis XIV to the end. So let's go ahead and move a little bit forward to America. So the first type of garden that was made for public use was called the stroll garden. And one of the most popular of those types was up in Massachusetts. And this was called the stroll garden. People would go to church. After church, they would walk through the garden. And what better setting for this garden, and Mount Auburn is actually cemetery. So you got to walk through, see your beloved dead folk, and enjoy the landscape around them. So move ahead a little bit more to what's called the pleasure garden. Most famous of all pleasure gardens would be Tivoli. And then the American version of that, Central Park, by the father of all landscape architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright. So these ideas of gardens is much more of a public place now for everybody to enjoy, kind of evolved into what then became the national parks. National parks set up by the United States of America, first national parks in the world, preserved the history and the geology, flora and fauna of the United States. So, and then from this, we evolved to what would then be the Columbia Exposition, the White City, designed by a landscape architect, worked on with architects to create kind of this first totally immersive experience from an architecture standpoint, landscape architecture standpoint, all harmoniously put together for sheer enjoyment and entertainment for everybody. If you haven't read Devil in the White City, you need to read it. As a designer, it is an amazing book of how this came to be. And it rings true today through every project you work on, everything that they went through. So, Coney Island. Coney Island really kind of the first escapism from an amusement standpoint in the Americas, off the coast of New York City. The reason it kind of grew into what it was as an entertainment or a destination was they built the subway out there. So now everybody in the hustle and bustle of New York City with no air conditioning could go out to Coney Island and experience a weekend away, a day away. And then had this little thing called World War II. Not too much going on in America. After the war, everybody started moving to the suburbs. They needed places to go, places to have fun. So Disneyland, 1955. Disneyland was the true themed entertainment destination. And along with that came Bill Evans on the left-hand side, father of theme park landscape architecture. So that's kind of where we were to where we are today. So this idea of growing the story, very clever, bad pun. So we want to create the experience with landscape architecture, or landscape. You know, when guests come to the park, we want it to really kind of hit on all those emotions that we showed in the first slides. We want them to come in and feel protected, feel in awe. We want them to be relaxed. The more relaxed they are, the more money they spend, the longer they stay. All of this works because of the landscape. And nowadays, landscape architecture in a traditional sense from a landscape or theme park standpoint is really called area development. Area development is this idea that it needs to enhance the architecture that's been created all from the story. And it also, you know, the greatest thing a landscape architect can do, or an area development designer, or us as themed entertainment designers, is you're never going to outsmart the guest. So if they come, say, to Epcot and they want to go to France, they want to see a parterre garden, so put a parterre garden in there. They don't want to see, you know, bamboo gardens or things like that, because they have a preconceived notion of what France is. They have a preconceived notion of what Adventureland is, what Liberty Square is, New Orleans Square. Any of these places are already embedded in their head based on what they've read in a book or a place that they've visited. So you're not going to fool anybody. And the more text and the more signs you put on something for somebody to read, you're going to lose them. So just use the simple cues. Use the architecture. Use the landscape. As an area development, there are many, many different kits of parts you can use. You have the landscape. You have the hardscape. You have water. And then again, you go down to the details. The details is really what's going to make that story rich. So if somebody walks in and they see palms swaying, and they see boardwalk, and they see rock, and then there's a water feature, and then they come upon a little tiki statue that's kind of hidden somewhere, that detail is what they're going to remember. But that detail, again, is playing off of everything else that came before it. So you're creating that picture. And here's a couple concept images. You know, you look at this piece of show art. This is very, very early on in the concept stage. What we want to do is we want to create a spooky ride. So you have the creepy trees crawling in off a frame. You have the mood lighting. You have this overarching bridge. You've got wrought iron gates. All these things tell the story that somebody that came from a different area or land in the theme park, they're going to a totally different experience, totally different ride that was different than what they went on before. And I guarantee you it'll be scary. Same thing with this one. Obviously, this isn't in the middle of New York City. This is out in the Caribbean, or I'm sorry, out in the Polynesian area someplace. So you're going to have some kind of tiki gods. You're going to have that, you know, Martin Denny music playing in the background. You're going to smell pina coladas. All that stuff is in this image, and this image is all done with area development and all the details. It tells the story before the story is written, or it becomes a product of the story. So again, the story carries all the way through on all elements in the themed entertainment design. So you have the architecture, you have the story, and then you have the area development. So as you go through this queue, you're standing in line for 60 minutes in the Florida heat. You know, thank God you're not standing in just concrete with stanchions on your sides. As you go in from the very beginning of the signage, you move through all these kit of parts that we talked about. The architecture, the hardscape, the landscape, all these things kind of set up the story that, okay, this place was once majestic, something obviously bad happened, the fountain's not even full of water, and then it kind of leads you on a path into the main pre-show for the Tower of Terror. Everything that happens now after you're inside the building can kind of reflect back out to the queue that we just walked through. So this next set of slides, just kind of setting the tone. You know, we've got this nice snapshot image that somebody has in their head of what Polynesia could be. And then the elements that you want to use to put into that. So we want to use the plumeria, we want to use those rocks, we want to use bird of paradise. All those things are somewhere nestled in that snapshot that somebody's taken. And again, that snapshot then tells the story because we've used all these visual cues. Very similar to, again, let's go back to the spooky story. Everybody likes a spooky story. You know, not everywhere in the world are you going to be able to have a creepy dead tree, but you can find one that's already dead, plant it, and then there's different types of landscape material, as a landscape architect should know, that will kind of evoke this sense of spookiness. The white caladiums, the black liriope, and then go ahead and frame that again with the wrought iron. I'm very sorry, I'm using these technical terms called botanical names for plants. So now if anybody has any questions about their yard, please let me know after this. I will take care of it, I swear to God. So let's go to this cold zone. Now, if we were doing a theme park, say, on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, this would probably be great 10 months out of the year. However, if we do this someplace in the Middle East or someplace where it never snows, we can still create the fake trees on the left-hand side, but then we can use plants that are indigenous to those zones that still carry out that idea of cold. So they're blue in tone, they're faded green in tone, and then complement that with man-made structures like a fake piece of ice and with an embedded T-Rex skeleton that's inside it. Again, you're creating that snapshot, and by creating that snapshot, you're playing off of people's emotions of the coldness of the landscape material, and then again, what they expect to see. So obviously this isn't Southeast Asia, but it looks pretty darn close. And again, the reason is the details. You know, that little boat on the bottom left of the photo, or the bottom right of the photo, is always docked there. Not because it works up and down that river, but it tells the story. Pacific Northwest. Same idea. Everybody has a preconceived notion of what happens in the Pacific Northwest at an old logging mill. You know, we want to see conifers. We want to see, you know, the light as it penetrates through the landscape, and there's this mist that kind of forms from the water, and you know, there's an old mill wheel in clapboard siding. English gardens. Not everybody gets to visit an English garden, but you can if you wanted to, over in Epcot. Going through and setting this up, I realized I go to Epcot way too much. Especially at Flower and Garden Show, and I guess that's part of my trade, but I probably have over 5,000 photos, and half of those are the exact same one. So my wife hates me. So I know I went very, very quick, so I apologize, but if we look at this next series of slides, it's not one piece or one element that tells the story, but it's all these other pieces that you kind of knit together that give you that snapshot, that make you reflect when you're driving home or you're flying home from wherever you came from. You know, I've never been to Paris, but I was at Epcot, and they had this really cool courtyard that had trees, that had architecture that it had to be in Paris, but there's no way, if anybody had been, knows that any of those buildings would ever occupy the same block in Paris. But collectively, they all make that mental snapshot of somebody that's been to Paris. You know, that is a Parisian courtyard through and through, but you will never have those countryside buildings in the background in the middle of Paris. So we have a very nice landscape lantern standing somewhere. Well, let's go ahead and complement that with a nice tree. And again, kind of evoke that emotion that one would have under a big majestic tree. Fold into that some architecture. And now we have what could be reminiscent of American Revolutionary time. Three-tiered fountain, very, very popular in New Orleans, and also that magnolia tree. Let's fold into that some architecture in wrought iron, and we end up at an old antebellum mansion. This view never gets old for me. I missed the monorail on this one. I apologize. It makes it much more complete. But again, the idea of using landscape to generate an emotion for guests is a very, very powerful tool. Not only because it tells the story, but it also makes people engage emotionally. And either that emotion or that memory at the park is going to create new memories that they can tell their kids or their family or their friends. Or the best part of the landscape is it makes them think back to when they were younger and they were at a different place. And by doing that and using that as telling the story, it makes your project and their experience 10 times better. And ultimately that's what the goal is to create this guest experience that's you can't have anywhere else except right here. So thank you for my quick presentation.